German Marshall Fund of the United States, and I want to wish a warm welcome to everyone in the room. In particular, I am delighted to welcome Germany's Minister for Economic Affairs and Energy, Peter Altmaier, to GMF. I am delighted that you're taking the time to share German policy and your priorities in these important areas with us this afternoon. I also want to welcome your entire delegation and your wonderful ambassador to the U.S., Dr. Emily Haber. It is great to have all of you at GMF. Minister Altmaier is known to many of us in the room, not only because he is a committed Atlanticist, but also because of his stellar record of public service. Prior to assuming his current position, he was minister in the Chancellor's office from December of 2013 to March of 2018, and served briefly during that time as acting finance minister. Chancellor Merkel is known to have great trust and confidence in Peter Altmaier, and during his time in the Chancellery, she asked him to serve as the refugee coordinator, managing the most politically sensitive issue in Germany at the time. Previously, he served as environment minister, and he is a longtime member of the German parliament, the Bundestag. This afternoon, Minister Altmaier will begin by providing some keynote remarks on the state of transatlantic relations. And as we noted in the invitation, that relationship is navigating turbulent times. I will then engage the minister briefly in a conversation, and then we'll open up to all of you for questions. This event is on the record, so I'll encourage all of you to tweet, and the hashtag is GMFUS. And with that, please join me in welcoming Minister Altmaier to the stage. Thank you.
Thank you so much for coming. It's in the beginning of summer recess. It's hot weather, as almost always in this period of the year. But you decided spending half an afternoon in debating American-European relationship. And this is not only most welcome, it is badly needed. It is badly needed because over the last couple of years, and I'm not talking about the last couple of months, I'm talking about the last couple of years, when we have seen so many important changes on both sides of the Atlantic, a number of misunderstandings, a number of misconceptions, and a number of even disagreements have emerged. And therefore, it's important taking stock and discussing what our priorities are, whether we have a common vision, whether we can achieve a common vision on the most challenging problems around the world, and especially in our relationship. To start with, we have a completely different perception on both sides of the Atlantic. If I may trust opinion polls, recent surveys, when asked how do you consider the relations with the US, 3/4 of respondents in Germany consider our relations with the US as poor, just a quarter as good. In the US, fortunately, it's just the other way around. Whilst only a quarter said our relations were poor, 70% of all respondents said they were good. And then the astonishing fact, when listening to some of my American counterparts and some of the people in important offices, I have the impression that Germany is seen by the leading personnel as a country not behaving in a good way, consuming too much, spending too little, and especially for defense matters and others. And when we are coming to Washington or talking about transatlantic relationship, we are always emphasizing the long-standing relationship and how important it is. But nevertheless, we have a completely opposite perception on both sides of the Atlantic. Second introductory remark, when we look at the problems we are facing, then it is very, very astonishing. We have, for example, a lot of question marks about the stability and the future of governments in Europe and in the US. To start with Europe, Europe will probably not have, before the end of the year, a new European Commission. The Commission President, hopefully, will get elected next week in European Parliament, but then a lengthy procedure will start to select the individual commissioners in cooperation with the countries, attributing to them concrete dossiers and competences, and then the new commission will take office on the 1st of November, only later this year. Until that date, we will have to cope with the European Parliament without a European Commission. Looking at the United Kingdom, this important neighbor of Germany and other European countries, and so much involved and so important for transatlantic relationship and cooperation within NATO. The UK has been struggling now for more than 2 years with consequences of Brexit referendum. Question is, will they leave? Will they stay? Will they extend Article 51 another time? Will we accept it? What are the conditions? And even if they would leave one day, would it be a no deal or a Brexit with a deal? And what would be the future relationship between the UK on the other one side and the rest of the EU on the other side? When looking at countries like Germany, we have, as I would put it, despite all the unstable elements, we are coping with still a stable government. I would even expect the government lasting somewhat longer than expected by so many. But nevertheless, Chancellor Merkel has announced she will not run in 2021. So that means her last term in office will come to an inevitable end. All the questions related to that can be seen with question marks, as well as all the other question marks I have already mentioned. Look at Spain, look at Greece, look at Italy, look at so many other European countries. And then, of course, in the United States, there is another presidential election next year. And when looking at the polls, it is so difficult to know what the result of the presidential election is going to be. The president has recovered in the polls, but it is still quite narrow. It is too close to call. And my impression is this is a situation that will continue until the very end of the campaign. So we will have a campaign as people running for president, but we will have not a clarity about the future administration until the end of next year. Lots of question marks, many, perhaps too many question marks. I wouldn't agree with that thesis. I believe that many of the question marks can be resolved, can be deleted, if we have a clear commitment to transatlantic relationship, to fair partnership on both sides, and to cooperation instead of conflict. And this relates especially to all the question marks linked not to personnel, but to substance. And if I may mention some, it is trade. The trade conflict that began last year with tentative tariffs on aluminum and steel. It is the question whether international trade should be organized in a multilateral way based on rules and based on rules of WTO, or whether it should be organized in a more unilateral way and bilateral way, what we call managed trade as a new concept emerging. Will we rely on free and open markets in the future? Can we establish an international global market based on market access for everybody? with level playing fields, with protection of intellectual property, and acceptance of the rules of WTO? Or will we see and face a fragmentation of global markets that will lead us, despite the conclusion of so many bilateral and multilateral free trade arrangements, like the African free trade area, like Mercosur, like the European-Japanese free trade agreement? Will it lead to fragmentation and therefore put a big obstacle to the further development of international trade? Look at Iran, look at Russia, and of course look at China. And when looking at China, it's of course on the one side a short-term challenge to convince China of the need of applying a level playing field in the relationship with the US and of Europe. We have much in common in this regard. And when the meeting of the ministers of trade of G20 took place in Tokyo 4 weeks ago, in the negotiations, the work on the final declaration, the US and Europe were cooperating and defending the same principles in this respect. But when it came to the question how to reform WTO in a way that the appellate body would become an efficient and an effective institution again, then we had more in common, I'm sorry to say it, with some Asian countries around the table than with our friends in the US and in Washington. And when looking at China, it's not just a matter how we can resolve these short-term challenges, but it's also the question about the future of our global trade on a medium and long-term perspective. This is my second trip to the States within 1 year. I had 4 or 5 trips to Asian countries, incidentally. In the same period of time, I went to Japan twice, to China also twice. I went to Indonesia, to Vietnam, and I realized the incredible, the unprecedented economic dynamic in the region. I'm not talking just about China. The dynamic in China is a very impressive one as well. But China is surrounded by densely populated countries with hundreds of millions of people. In all these countries, there's one ambition of the younger generation, and not just the younger generation, and this is shaping, creating the same amount of individual welfare, standard of living, social protection, environment protection, infrastructure, healthcare, as it is guaranteed in the US, in Europe, and elsewhere in the industrialized countries. And they are so numerous in people. They are growing so rapidly that we can imagine that if a country like China, where the GDP per head today is just a quarter of what we have in the US or in Europe, what it means if in 20 or 25 years' time, the GDP in China would be the same per capita than it is in Europe or in China already today and then. And this is, of course, meaning that there will be a shift in international influence. And how do we respond to that? I believe that both the US and Europe would have a warm interest in applying rule-based trade for everybody. Because in 10, 20, 25 years' time, it is no longer Europe or the US, and even not both together, being able to impose unilateral decisions and sanctions on others. We will then be outnumbered. We will be still influential, still wealthy countries, but the context will have changed dramatically. And then, just to mention it and not to waste too much time for discussion, before coming to Washington, I went to San Francisco and the Valley to have talks with researchers thinking about future, thinking about AI. We have seen a rapid acceleration of innovation pace over the last couple of years. It is due to technological progress. Today we have supercomputers we never had imagined before. We have an almost unlimited capacity of storing and processing data. We have, with the help of AI, we have the possibility to shorten the delays for innovation dramatically. I was allowed making a trip with an autonomous car in San Francisco of the company Zoox, and it was able to drive in the roads of San Francisco for 2.5 or 3 kilometers in a densely populated, crowded area with dogs and cats and cars parked alongside the road and unpredictable events, and without any interruption. Without any interference by human driver, the car was able to drive and easily, and especially, that's very important, safely. So when we imagine what will change in such a world, and when you extend it and expand it to the issue of climate change and climate protection, and the issue of how to protect the economic basis of our society and the planet, then you have an idea on how much the problem-solving capacity of politics will be needed in order, first of all, to preserve a stable environment, not in the economic sense of the ecological sense of the term, but in the political, in the military, and in the ecological sense of the term. How to provide a stable framework, how making possible that market economy, that private initiative, that business can develop to the sake of our people without destroying our environment. How can we cope with that? My thesis is, and it is felt in the bottom of my heart, that nobody can take on all these challenges by its own. We are simply not strong enough. And this applies to all countries worldwide. It applies to China. It applies to the US. It applies certainly to Europe, and even more certainly to Germany. We can resolve the problems. We can come to good and long-term solutions, but this would require our readiness to cooperate, to trust each other. And then, if you would combine forces, would be able to achieve quite a lot. I attended on behalf of Chancellor Merkel the last meeting of the Belt and Road Conference in Beijing with the presence of President Xi. And what impressed me was the enormous consequence of the development of infrastructure, logistical infrastructure, roads and harbors and railways and airlines in order to make sure that Chinese goods, also in the year 2050, can be exported to all parts of the world, to every destination. We are concerned, both the Americans and the Europeans, that on the end of the day it could become a one-way infrastructure. That at the end of the day, goods and products from one big country would be privileged at the expense of others. But then when I listen to all the ingenious ideas put forward by Chinese politicians and ministers, now for several years already, then I asked myself the question, why didn't we in Europe and in the US not put forward a similar initiative and a similar idea? Because if we want to stay competitive over the next 40, 50 years, if we want to export our goods to the growing markets in Asia and Africa and elsewhere in the world, we will be in exactly the same situation, in exactly the same needs than the American and then the Chinese companies will be. And therefore, if we would combine forces, not only between the US and Europe, but also with China, then we could develop a truly neutral infrastructure that would be affordable for everybody and that would not be misused by one of the sides concerned. And this brings me to a very key question. We have published as a European Union a paper on China recently. I'm sure you have seen it. And then we have said in this paper, okay, we are partners, but we are also competitors. And then it was mentioned at the end of the paper that we are systemic competitors as well. I think this is true. But at the same time, I believe we have an interest that we will not go back after what has been achieved already, that we will not try to resolve all these issues just by trade arrangements and provisions, but that we will imagine solutions that would involve others, that would help us to incorporate our genes, our European American genes, our vision of free and impartial and unprohibited trade into the heads and the hearts of so many million people. It's not about the Communist Party in China in the first place. It is not about some old-fashioned people sticking to planification instead of market competition. No, it is about the future of the younger generation in these countries. And then what really was very impressive to me, President Xi in his speech, and in the case I'm delivering this speech, you will see it was not prepared by my political bureau, but by myself after breakfast this morning. But when President Xi delivered the speech, I was pretty much sure that every single word, every single phrase was pre-discussed and written and drafted by purpose. And he said, well, please do not treat our students abroad as second-rank people. Don't discriminate them. And then he added and he said, and we have learned so much and will still continue to learn from the Western countries about skills and about innovation. But we know we have the duty and the obligation to reward also our partners in the Belt and Road Initiative, and therefore China will offer and provide tens of thousands of education places for students for all the countries being involved in the Silk and Road Initiative, from Kazakhstan, from Belarus, from all the neighboring countries. And then I realized how ingenious the approach was. China, being an emerging country, perhaps even industrialized country, has realized it will rely for quite a while still on the exchange of our countries, but it has also understood that the fact that the US were open for foreign students and Europe was open and Germany was open for foreign students from other parts of the world has not only helped to develop the other regions in far distances, but it has allowed us to establish economic relationship benefiting our own economies. And this is what we have to have in mind. We are not alone in the universe. The US are not alone, Europe is not alone, but we are together not alone in the universe. We will have to decide on concrete concepts, concrete ideas and initiatives. I believe we can meet the challenge, we can meet the expectations, but we should not wait until the next European president has taken office, until the next American president has been introduced in the inauguration ceremony, until the next German chancellor will be in the chancellery. No, we have to act now. There's no time to be wasted, and I believe that a good working American-German relationship could be a core element to make sure that this is not a wasted time, but the beginning of a new era. Thank you so much for your attention.
There were two overarching takeaways. I mean, you gave a very eloquent presentation about the global shift of power that we're all experiencing. And there are big questions for all of us, we see China as a rising power. We see a United States that's wrestling with what its role in the world should be. We see a Europe, and you suggested all of the changes taking place, including at the level of EU leadership, that's looking for its role in the world. And all of us facing this challenge of technology, which is going to have impacts that we're only beginning to think through and try to understand. And your underlying message there was no one can take on these challenges alone. And I think that is a powerful message, and a message that we at GMF very much endorse. Our mission is about strengthening transatlantic cooperation in the spirit of the Marshall Plan, in the spirit of those values that we have built this rules-based order on over the past 70 years. And I want to draw you out on several of the things that you referred to. Clearly, one of the areas of turbulence in the transatlantic relationship, as you mentioned, is trade. The German-American trade and investment relationship is very significant to both of us. And at the moment, there is a very real threat of U.S. tariffs hanging over us. Is that tariffs on aircraft subsidies, on automobiles, on Nord Stream 2? So while I very much agree with your call for the importance of cooperation and trust, there's a very real possibility that we could be entering a deeply unpleasant part in the transatlantic relationship. I know that you'll be seeing USTR Lighthizer tomorrow, and I know you've had some meetings today, but it would be great to get your thoughts on what you think the state of play is and what your constructive suggestions are as to how we move to a different, more cooperative place.
Yes, thank you so much. First of all, let me thank the German Marshall Fund, because what you have done over the last decades is enormous contribution. And I remember, when I read my prepared notes for the speech, I was told that this is a very room where President Kennedy and Chancellor Adenauer had dinner in the beginning of the 60s, and this made a huge impression on me, and I believe that this is an obligation for all of us to keep this relationship, this wonderful relationship intact. And as far as the problems are concerned, we have to resolve them one by one. This morning I had talks with the treasurer, with Stephen Mnuchin, and we were discussing amongst others, all these issues of Nord Stream 2, which has a potential risk of a poisoning relationship. And when you look at the arguments, the question is, can we define a common denominator? I have proposed, and it's not new, I say it in every speech I'm delivering on this, why can't we have a three-pillar approach? Pillar number one, we have a vital interest, both the US and Europe and Germany, not leaving Ukraine alone. That means whatever happens to Nord Stream 2, even if Nord Stream 2 will be completed within a foreseeable delay, then we have to make sure that a substantial gas transit through Ukraine will continue. This is why I have initiated last year direct talks, the only direct talks for more than 1 year between Ukraine and Russia. Direct talks. We started in Berlin with the Ukrainian Minister for Foreign Affairs Klimkin, the Russian Minister for Energy Novak, and the Vice President of the Commission Šefčovič. And these talks, they are difficult, they are demanding, but they are still going on. And the idea is when the present transit agreement runs out by the end of this year, not to stop the transit, but to continue and to have a new agreement according to European regulations, and that would enhance and improve security of Ukraine. Second pillar is that, of course, Germany will import in the next couple of years, and Europe will import more and not less gas. This is something you cannot avoid because the capacities in the Netherlands, in the United Kingdom will slow down, will run out, and our demand for natural gas will increase because we have energy transition in Germany. We are going to close down, to switch off all the coal-fired power plants within 18 years now, from now, and that means there is a growing demand for gas. And if we would import all the gas from Russia, regardless whether through Ukraine or through Nord Stream 2 pipeline, we would increase our dependency. And this is not a good idea, and therefore we have decided in Germany to construct 2 LNG terminals in the north of the country. I took that initiative. We are spending several million of public money to support private companies in constructing and opening LNG gas terminals, and I hope they are ready by 2022, 2023. We have organized a big conference in January in Berlin with American exporters of LNG gas. And now we have a good perspective that if the gas is competitive, it can be transported and used in Germany. And the third pillar, that is Nord Stream 2. Nord Stream 2 is a project that is under planning for a very long time. It has been realized for almost 60 or 70%. We believe if Pillar 1 and Pillar 2 is realized with the same energy and the same amount of dedication as Nord Stream 2 was planned, then the importance of this third pillar will not be the same as without. And if all the people on both sides of the Atlantic are committed, then we can resolve it. The same applies to the cars. I know that the trade surplus of Europe and Germany vis-à-vis the United States is a matter of concern for the American president. We are also concerned by it, by the way, because in a sound economy, you have an interest in balanced situations. But at the same time, you cannot come to balanced situations by tariffs and customs. You can achieve it by competitivity, by enhancing your own economic competitivity. And therefore, we have to think about sound solutions. We have offered a free trade agreement on industrial products instead of the old TTIP proposal that was not realized. We are ready to talk about regulatory cooperation and mutual recognition of certificates for products, especially from American companies. So if there is a political will, we could come to a solution before the end of the year. That is my position, and I know that many people think, oh well, if we have higher tariffs on German cars, perhaps German car makers would produce more cars in the US. We are already producing a lot of cars in the US, and German car makers in the US are the biggest car exporters in the US, because many of the cars are exported to Asian countries, including China, and this is contributing a lot to the American GDP growth. So if we would come to stable trade relationship between China and the US, between the US and Europe, I'm convinced that more German companies would invest more money in new capacities in the US. As long as the conflicts are lurking around, as long as there is a fear and a concern of a trade war, or at least of trade tensions, they will be rather reluctant and wait until a solution is found. I believe we can come to very reasonable solutions if our politicians and our heads of state and government come together and are ready to accept real compromises.
Let me just have 2 follow-ups on that. First, I'm curious, do you feel like you got traction with the 3-pillar argument as it related to Nord Stream 2 with our Secretary of the Treasury? And secondly, you mentioned the German and EU support for a free trade agreement on industrial products. Of course, the Trump administration has been pushing to have agriculture included in those free trade talks, which appears to be a non-starter with the European side, and that US-EU free trade agreement seems to be the best antidote to the president not putting tariffs on cars. And I did note, I think you're going on to Alabama from here, which is a great way to highlight that German investment in the US. But just give us a sense of if you think you're getting traction with that three-pillar approach, A, and B, how optimistic are you on the US-EU free trade agreement?
First of all, I'm a very, very open guy, telling everything you might be interested in, except when it is was in close meetings with good friends and allies. So what I told the journalists and the media after the meeting was that it was a good and a constructive meeting, and I mean it. We had common ground in our exchange, and both of us willing to look for solutions instead of new conflicts. That is very important. The second thing is that I have developed the three-pillar approach because I had, since March last year, I had continuous talks with my colleagues in the European Commission, especially Commissioner Malmström and Commissioner Šefčovič. I had talks with my American partners and friends. The same applies to Mr. Röller in the Chancellery and others. We have developed this strategy. For example, when I took office in late March 2018, I made a telephone call to Secretary Ross, with whom I will meet also tomorrow. I said, well, I think the situation is serious. I'm ready to come at any convenient time. And then Secretary Ross replied immediately and said, well, what would you think about Monday? The telephone call was on Thursday night. And then I knew Cecilia Malmström would come on Tuesday. So if I had said, well, what would you think about Wednesday? Then he would see me as a rather weak minister. And if I said, well, I come on Monday, then there was some risk of a rift between the Commission and Germany. So I said, okay, I'm ready coming Monday, but you have to know that I will pre-discuss it with Cecilia, and we will have similar ideas, and we will have the same parallel strategies. And that was exactly what we did. And after 2 days, we had a shopping list. On this shopping list, we had this idea of the free trade arrangements for industrial products. We had regulatory cooperation, we had the recognition of certification, and we had LNG gas. And agriculture was not on that list because it was, of course, a struggle. What items to put on what place on that list? It was nothing more than a shopping list on a sheet of paper. But then when President Trump and President Juncker met at the end of July last year, both Cecilia and myself were surprised and pleased to see that this shopping list had made it to the summit between the two presidents. And at the end of the day, all the items on the list were found in the final declaration. And there was one added to it, that was the soybean issue, because when we had talks in March, the soybean problem did not yet exist. And we have resolved it over the last a couple of months in an impressive way. Therefore, it took a little bit longer than I expected to bridge the gap and to come to solutions. But I still think we can achieve it. And when you look at previous arrangements, it took almost 3 years agreeing on a mandate inside the European Union internally. This time it was just 1 year, and we had a mandate ready. And now my recommendation would be that we concentrate in the next couple of weeks in our negotiations on the less controversial issues, that we book quick and fast progress in these areas, and then we come back to the trade issue and see what we can do. Our French friends have a very valid argument by saying, well, we have concluded a lot of free trade arrangements recently with Mercosur, with other countries where agriculture is involved. They were, by the way, ready a couple of years ago to sign TTIP with rules for agricultural trade, and now it is a situation where both sides perhaps need a little bit more time, but this is something we can afford.
Okay, so now I'm not going to ask you something about what a U.S. policymaker said. I'm going to ask you something about something you said. And I was following your trip to San Francisco and thought it was really interesting that you put that technology focus on the trip. And I was reading a quote from that stop where you said that Germany has the right to technological sovereignty. And you said it in the context of data clouds. Data clouds should not only be set up in the US and China, but that Germany also has the right to ensure secure and reliable data storage. I don't want to focus on data clouds, but I would like to ask you to explain more broadly what you're thinking of when you talk about this right to technological sovereignty, and how does that extend to something like 5G?
Well, it extends to a lot of areas. But first of all, when I look at the traditional political debates in the US and in Europe, these are debates on steel and aluminum. These are debates on classical industries. Important debates, by the way, yes, I agree. But at the same time, the world is much more changed by digitization and artificial intelligence than by everything else. And this is something we have to realize. Angela Merkel was heavily criticized when she said all these digital issues are quite new in politics and it is difficult for many of us to understand. But it's true, it's not only new in politics, it is new in the business sector, where you have young specialists working with these issues every day, and then you have CEOs, CFOs, CBOs 20 years older without any idea what it means and what to do. But this is the biggest innovation cycle since the invention of the steam engine, and this is almost 300 years ago. And it will change. It will change the landscape. We will see a wave of disruptive innovation, where I personally believe, after having studied it for many, many years, I personally believe at the end of the transformation, we will have not less but more jobs than we have today. But there is no guarantee that the new jobs will emerge in the same geographical places where the old jobs will disappear. This is not only a technological disruption, it's a geographical disruption. It's an economic disruption. This is what we have to have in mind. And therefore, I believe no country will participate in the enormous economic growth potential with higher productivity, higher salaries, more standard of living, without having a technological competence that is needed to cope with the new transformation processes. And therefore I said, well, we need a technological sovereignty in these new areas. We have to participate in autonomous driving development. We have to participate in cloud solutions. And when you look at what we have said in Europe 10 years ago, I remember a debate where all the heads of states and governments said Europe needs a European cloud. But nothing was done to implement it. There was no strategy how to achieve it. And in the meantime, we have a couple of American companies and a couple of Chinese companies competing for cloud solutions worldwide. VW, the big German car maker, has now decided to host its data with Amazon and Microsoft. Others are hosting it with Chinese companies. When I published a draft industrial strategy, it was not in the first place about the old industries. It was about how to combine the old classical industries with the new world of the internet. And in order to achieve it, we need a trusted, reliable, efficient data infrastructure that would allow us to pool European data in order to have better training for algorithms, in order to make most of, to use the chances lying with this process. So this is the first thing, but there are many others as well. The US have been amazingly successful, not as a government, but as a country, as an economy, in developing a platform economy. Platform economy is perhaps the logic further development of market economy in a globalized digital world. All the big platforms are American citizens or Chinese citizens, Amazon and Uber and Google and Facebook and Alibaba and Tencent. Very few like Spotify coming from Europe or European countries. So this is a matter of concern for Europe. We should not complain about the success of others, but we should think what we can do to have a similar success, not in all of the areas concerned, and the fact that I have advocated European champions is not in order to prevent others from being champions as well, but to keep intact a level playing field. I can explain it with a very simple example. When China published its strategy, its industrial strategy, Made in China 2025, that was in 2015, there were very honest people, and they said, we will become the leading manufacturer for railway systems worldwide by 2025. And when you look at the market, it's a market worth at least $500 trillion over the next 15 years. That's an enormous amount. In African countries, in Turkey alone, it's about 30 billion, not 13, 30 billion, and the same in Africa, in American, Southern American countries, etc. So, and what did the Chinese do to achieve the target? They have merged all the existing railway companies producing trains and railway systems and signal systems to one big company, producing and selling 11 times more trains to other countries than Siemens, for example, is doing. And then Siemens was thinking about how to respond, and I said, well, we are simply not big enough to compete on a level playing field with this big Chinese company. And then they had talks with Alstom in France, and the idea was to have a merger in order to have a bigger entity capable to compete. And then they did not ask for subsidies, they did not ask for public protection. Then the European Commission said, well, we believe this is much too much. It would perhaps reduce the market competition in Europe, and the Chinese are not yet present in European markets. Was rejected, was not approved. And the most important argument was the Chinese are not yet there. 7 or 8 weeks ago, you could read in our newspapers that the Austrian railway companies has now ordered Chinese train systems, and that China is interested in taking over parts of the Czech railway system. They have already taken over parts of the Portuguese railway system. They have taken over the harbor of the Piraeus and many others. It's a strategy, and the question is, how do we respond to that? I'm not advocating copying the Chinese model one by one. I'm not advocating copying it at all. But we cannot have free and open and fair market competition if there are different rules on both sides of the table. That is my personal conviction.
I want to follow up on this briefly, and then I'm going to open it up to all of you. So you did create a storm of controversy in Germany with this national industrial strategy that you released in February. It was very much connected, it seemed from the outside, to the Siemens-Alstom merger and the failure of that. And one of the criticisms was that that kind of an industrial champion policy is incompatible with a free market economy. you're saying, well, you got to have the same rules of the road if you're going to compete. But I do want to connect it to 5G. I know you were in China 3 weeks ago. You met with Huawei. You actually have European companies that are competitive on this in Ericsson and Nokia. So would you advocate for a European champion on 5G and argue that the EU should be propelling those two forums forward?
Well, might be a surprise, but long before I went to China, I had talks with the CEO of Nokia and talks with the CEO of Ericsson, because I realized that the market share of Nokia and Ericsson together is even more than the market share of Huawei worldwide. It's a third of the international market. You say no, but yeah, the figures I have seen were indicating just this. And then I asked, what is the reason why Ericsson and Nokia are not present in the European markets, but in American markets and other markets worldwide? And the answer was, by my experts, that we have more competition in telecommunication services in Europe. We have 200 companies than we have in other parts of the world, for example, in the US, where you have 4 companies. As a result of this, flat rates for using the internet in the US are more expensive than in Europe. Because in Europe you have a higher degree of competition and therefore lower flat rates, cheaper flat rates, and that means our companies have lesser money and therefore are looking for cheaper equipment. Things are interdependent. And now the question is, what is a good state of market economy? Is it the American example where you have just 4 competitors, or is it the European example where you have about 200 competitors? And I believe there is no economic law or something like this where you can say it's exact the following number of competitors. And this was the reason why I initiated a debate on how to deal with this. I'm coming back to Huawei in a second. Of course it was controversial, because if I had tabled something that was not controversial, non-controversial, and nobody would have spent time reading it, it would not have mentioned in the newspapers, and it would have nothing changed. So if you want, and this is a lesson we can learn from the American president, if we want to change things and to make a difference, then we have to be prepared for provoking debates, for fueling controversial debates, and that's exactly what I have done. It is not always a pleasant exercise, by the way, I can tell you, but I do not regret it, and I think it is badly needed in order to make sure that our chances for the next 20, 30 years are realized and not wasted. As far as Huawei is concerned, I believe we are seeing right now certain conversions. First of all, from the beginning, we have taken seriously the concerns of our American friends. When I was informed a couple of months ago, first about the ideas floating around in Washington, the concerns, I said, yes, indeed, it is a matter of concern, and then we engaged in talks with France, Spain, United Kingdom, Germany, because all of us have Huawei equipment at a considerable degree. Second, we engaged in talks with the European Commission, the British Commissioner Julian King. I met with him twice on this issue. Thirdly, we have amended we are in a process of amending our legislation. We have published recommendations for security and safety requirements. This will be enshrined in legislation within the next couple of months. And then we will have very precise requirement for certification of security of equipment. It's not that easy to implement because sometimes there are backdoors, not so easily to identify, but I believe we can do much more than we have done in the past. And then there was the last controversy where we had some difficulties back in Europe. That was that the Americans had listed Huawei on the entity list and have no longer allowed American companies making a business with Huawei. We cannot do this without a reliable proof that you can present to courts, and it will be subject to court decision. So I have said we are very sensitive about it, but we cannot make such a harsh decision. Now, having listened carefully to the meeting between President Trump and President Xi, my impression is that the debate in the US is shifting a little bit, because if all of us, for example, would say no longer Huawei equipment in critical parts of the infrastructure, then the business of Huawei would shrink approximately by a third. That's at least what I was told in the breakfast meeting I had with the founder of Huawei recently in China. And this, of course, that would be good news from an American and a security perspective, perhaps. But then our American friends realized that that would mean that the business of important American companies producing and delivering parts to Huawei, later on then used in Europe and elsewhere in the world, would also shrink by 1/3. And that has provoked some protests and some concerns within the American companies and the trade unions. And now there are some ideas and some announcements that things can be handled in a more flexible way. And I believe this can help us to come also to a joint American-European standpoint on this.
Well, thanks so much. I am certain you've provoked some questions, so I'm going to turn to all of you. We'll start here and then go around.
Thanks, Minister.
And if you say who you are, please.
I will. I'm Jeff Rathke. I'm the president of the American Institute for Contemporary German Studies at Johns Hopkins. And you talked just now in some detail about Huawei and the technology aspects of German policy, and also the cooperation with the United States. Of course, there's growing concern in Germany. There's also high concern across a number of issues in the United States. So I guess my question to you is twofold. First, do you have the impression from your talks with American officials that they prioritize cooperation with Germany and Europe on China over issues like the trade disputes with Europe? First question. And the second question is, can you be more specific about the specific areas of cooperation that you see between Germany and the United States with regard to China's growing role in the global economy and more generally? Thanks.
Thanks. That's a very good question, and I try to give you a brief answer on this. Yes, I believe in joint approaches, in joint initiatives. And when I had my first talks with Rob Lighthizer and Wilbur Ross last year here in Washington, I explicitly said, well, when it comes to market access, to takeovers, and the conditions for takeovers in both countries, where it is much easier for a Chinese company taking over a German company than it is the other way around, where you have to ask for permission, and it is just a minority takeover that is possible, and you need a joint venture in most of the cases. And I said, well, this is something we can cooperate. We can cooperate with regard to protection of intellectual property. We can cooperate with regard to investment conditions. European Union is negotiating with China an investment agreement that shall be ready by 2020. And this clearly have been matters of interest for the American administration as well. When you look at the further development of things, however, we realized that one day the administration took a unilateral decision to put higher tariffs on China, because they came to the conclusion that would be perhaps easier to achieve something in all the other areas if you start with higher tariffs on trade. In some areas, this is something where Europe was looking from outside what was going on and happening, and I believe if we could streamline and coordinate our respective efforts a little bit more, then it would be in the interest of good results for both the US and Europe.
Super. I saw the gentleman by the fireplace. Okay.
Perhaps. Otherwise, I'm talking too much.
Thank you. Chris Bledavsky from the Manufacturers Alliance for Productivity and Innovation. You have explained how the Chinese railway business was consolidated into one company, and then you explained how Germany and France would like to see a European champion, and you named two companies being the monopolist in Europe. At the same time, in the recent past, the French President Macron and many German politicians have been openly calling for Google to be broken up. Google, which has competitors, active competitors in every segment it operates, so it's a very competitive marketplace. Why would it be okay in Europe to have monopolists, why the Europeans do not see the same way in the United States and Google would have to be dismantled? Thank you.
Okay, hold on. We're going to pull the woman in here in the second row. Yeah.
Hi, Andrea Shalal with Reuters. I wanted to ask you about the kind of ongoing dispute with the United States on the car issue. And I know that you said you want to pick these problems and solve them one at a time. But can you walk through, you talked a lot about Nord Stream and what could be happening there in terms of LNG. You talked about the aircraft subsidies a little bit. On the car front, are you seeing any movement, any progress? And do you think that the tariffs, will take effect then after the end of this sort of nearly 6-month period? So on that specific front. And then I just wanted to ask you to elaborate, if you could, your vision of the future relationship with China looks at a much more collaborative approach. The United States seems to be, at this moment, pulling apart farther and farther from China and pursuing a separation of the two economies. Where do you think there can be common ground there with the approach that is generally being pursued in Europe?
Perhaps a third one, and then I will.
Okay, there was a woman right in the, was it in the, who did I see? Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I would like to follow up on the Reuters question. My name is Annette Meyers from Handelsblatt Germany. Like the US administration doesn't seem to believe in your optimism or in de-escalation that much. I mean, today we received the news that there might be even extra tariffs against France in regard to the...
Extra tariffs?
Yeah, like they might because of the tech conflict, the tech taxes. So, the signals are more in the direction of escalation. So I would like to know in general, what exactly makes you so optimistic that we're going to have a solution on that? And just one quick follow-up question. You promised last year when you went to Washington that you will travel to DC like at least every other month. And I would like to know why that didn't happen.
Is that enough for you?
Yes.
All right, and I've got the three in that corner for next. So.
It's very interesting questions. Shall I answer them all? I have no idea.
Yes, you have to.
So first, the question from the right side of the audience. Macron was advocating breaking up Google, and you are pleading in favor of national champions. Is there any competition at all? Well, to be clear, I'm a big believer in competition, and also in competition and merger regulation. This is undisputed, all this has been invented, by the way, by the Americans. It was the antitrust legislation in the 30s. Ask the Rockefeller family what happened as a consequence. And when you have a real monopoly, then you have to think how to react, and in some cases, breaking it up is a solution on national level, on European level, in America, wherever. This is not the case, by the way, by the railways, because we have 4 companies in Europe still competing. We have Alstom and Siemens, I've already mentioned, and then we have Bombardier on the one side and the Spanish CAF on the other side. So these 2 companies could perfectly merge. They could stay competitive alone if they would specialize more. We would have some competition, and we would have competition in Europe between the Chinese railway company and the new champion. So there would always be 2, 3, 4 or even more companies competing. There are also American companies able to compete in Europe. It's not about one single monopolist on the world market, but always several competitors. And what I want to make sure is that the German companies are not that small that they have no chance anymore playing a part in that competition. As far as Google is concerned, I had very good meetings yesterday, the day before yesterday, with Philipp Schindler, who's the CBO of Google, and I had many talks with Eric Schmidt when he still was the CEO of Google and Alphabet in previous years. I do not see Google as the major threat to Germany. I believe Google has contributed a lot to our digital revolution in a positive way. But of course, in the long run, it is important that competition on a global scale remains possible. I'm not dealing with breaking up of Google. It's not my competence. But I know that Commissioner Vestager, for example, who is our merger control commissioner, is always engaged in talks with Facebook, with Apple, with Google, with Microsoft, and this is something that is a normal case in international politics. And Schindler made it clear and said, well, we are a big company, yes, but there are different fields of activity for Google, Microsoft, and others, Facebook and Uber and Amazon. I said, yes, but this is exactly under the angle of merger rules and competition, a part of the problem, of the solution. If all the big 4 American companies would have the same field of activity, we would have perfect competition amongst them. And then it would not be important whether you have a competitor in Europe or elsewhere, but you would have competition. If every single of them would become a monopolist, then of course things would be different. But this is not, by the way, not with regard to all of them the case. I had yesterday a meeting with Tim Cook of Apple, and Tim Cook explained to me they have exactly a market share of 1/3 of the worldwide production, because there are others like Huawei, like Samsung, producing important parts of smartphones, tablets, etc. The second questions of Reuters have been 4 questions, if I listened carefully. First of all, what makes me so optimistic? Well, all my talks I've had so far with American colleagues, and it was not just when I came to Washington, it was in Germany, it was in Brussels, it was in many, in the margins of international conferences, have been productive and good. And advocating my American counterparts and friends, I must say, I'm always impressed how much constructive spirit I can find here in Washington and in every single meeting elsewhere with the American administration. There is a 70-year-old tradition of partnering with Europe, and the GMF has contributed to that very much. I have referred to it. So that is why I'm basically optimistic, and because I believe that people will realize the matters of conflict amongst us, between us, are not the most important issues on the agenda, and therefore we should concentrate on things that really matter. The car issue, is certainly an important one for both the United States and Germany, but the question how to resolve it is difficult. We have the situation that German car manufacturers are producing 80% of the worldwide global demand for upper class cars. Mercedes, BMW, etc. Not all of them are produced in Germany. Many are produced by German producers in the US, in China, in other parts of the world, but as a matter of fact, they are very successful. And the question is, why do American consumers pay much more money for a Mercedes or a BMW if they could have for the same amount of money a Japanese car, an American car, or a French car? And the answer is because consumers like it, they love it, and this is something where you have to stay competitive, and where we are prepared, by the way, engaging in a dialogue. And then many of my counterparts say, "Oh, yes, listen, but we have 2.5% tariffs for Japanese and German cars. You guys have 10% tariffs for American cars." And then at the beginning, my staff has written text for me where I should say, oh, well, when it comes to pickup, you have 25%. I said, well, this is a detailed question. That's not my point. My point is, let's offer 0 tariffs on both sides. And then the cars becoming cheaper for the consumers. We have a level playing field, and every consumer can buy the car he or she wants most. This was welcomed in the first step, by the way, by many colleagues on the American side. And then when they had thought about it for a while, there was an opinion growing in the US that would mean that Germans would export even more cars to the US than before. I have no idea whether this is correct or not, but it is something where you need clear principles, and then you have to wait and to see what the results would be. The third question was the China collaborative approach. I don't see it as a contradiction or a conflict between the American position and my ideas, because we agree on as far as short-term conflicts and issues are concerned. And as I said, we have to make sure that China is not only an industrialized country, but acts as an industrialized country as well. And therefore, we need more practices corresponding to the rule of law. We need protection of copyright. We need better access to markets. I have mentioned it all together. What I meant was the long-term cooperation, and I was inspired to that by every 2 years we have the Asia Pacific Conference of the German Business Association. More than 3,000 companies and business people are gathering. Last time in Indonesia, next time in Tokyo. And in the margins of that conference, I attended a meeting that was called Young Leaders Summit, organized by Bertelsmann Foundation. Some of you might know them. And there were young CEOs, business people, people from think tanks, universities, from different countries: Bangladesh, India, China, Indonesia, Vietnam, Thailand, and many others. And all between 25 and 40 years old. And then I realized that most of these younger generation from different countries, the speakers at least who asked for the floor, were sharing similar ideas and thoughts than I can see in the US and in Europe, and talking to the same generation of younger people. And I see it as an enormous chance. They have a specific view on climate change, a specific view on global responsibility, a specific view on how to respect some ethical principles. And this was new to me, because before, when I was serving in the Chancellery, I was not allowed traveling across the world every day. So my experience was a limited one. And I believe, when I said we have to spread our genes, Europe is inspired by the enlightening 250 years ago. We have acquired our principles, our values over the last 70 years after the terrible Second World War. That was not only a military disaster for Germany, but a moral disaster, and that had so badly damaged so many people. And these lessons learned can serve also as useful elements for other people. And therefore, I say we have to defend our economic interest, and that means level playing field. But at the same time, we should not refuse the younger generation in the countries concerned, but make an offer to them to cooperate. Many of them have been students in the US, have been students in Germany. They are under the impression and fascinated by our social and democratic model, and we cannot afford losing this generation of younger people. And therefore, I will recommend to my colleagues back in Germany that we accept more foreign students from the region, not less, that we offer them training. And when I went to the bilateral trip to Beijing last time, I discussed with the Deputy Prime Minister, who was also the negotiator in the trade negotiations with Rob Lighthizer, Liu He. I made a proposal saying, why can't we organize a round table of CEOs under 40 years of age of both sides, and then they would have a meeting 1 year in Berlin, the other year in Beijing or in Shanghai, and we would arrange for meetings with high-ranking politicians. We would show them some interesting sites, and that was something we are now working on. And by the way, we have this long-standing friendship and partnership with the US, but we don't have such a format between our two countries. And so if we would create a similar format between the business community in the US and the business community in Germany, I would see it as another achievement. And this is exactly how we have to conceive our political strategies. The last point that was asked by the lady was why I'm so optimistic that I already answered. And then you said, well, last year you promised coming to the US every month. Well, it's not correct. I said more frequently. Now, having paid the second visit within roughly 1 year, it is more frequent than it was in the past. But I agree there is some margin for improvement. So please invite me, and I will be happy to attend. Thank you so much.
I think there are lots of other questions, but I'm just going to take the last two because there were two people who've been on the list for a long time. One was Peter and the other was Constanze, and I apologize to the others. I'm trying to do this as hands as I saw them.
Thank you. Peter Rausch is also from the American Institute for Contemporary German Studies at Johns Hopkins. Mr. Minister, when I listened to your remarks, I noticed that on the one hand, you seem very concerned about institutional fragmentation in trade policy, but I think I'm right that you seemed a little more relaxed about fragmentation in the real economy. You're comfortable with creating European champions. In your industry paper, if I got it right, you seem also to prefer that European companies participate in value chains in the European single market. I can understand the concern vis-a-vis China, but what about the United States? We have a deeply integrated, mutually beneficial relationship between the US and the EU. US and European companies are participating in the same value chains, which makes them stronger competitors, for example, against China. So shouldn't we be also worried about fragmentation in the real economy and especially in the transatlantic economy?
Hi, Constanze Stelzenmüller, Brookings Institution. I have a follow-up to your remarks about Nord Stream 2. One is I'd like to know, given the comments from Alexei Miller of the Gazprom leadership, that once Nord Stream 2 is built, the volume of transit through the Ukrainian national pipeline will be reduced to 10% of its current volume. How and why are you confident that the Russians are going to play your game? And my second question is, the one answer that's often given to explain why things have changed and are now better for Ukraine is that we now have better storage facilities and better reverse flow. But it seems to me if that reverse flow is not to stop at the Ukrainian border, it would mean repairing the Russian transit pipeline, which is in a very bad state of disrepair. So my second question is, what are we doing to change that? Thank you.
Okay. Thank you so much. First question asked by Peter. Well, I'm always concerned about fragmentation. May it be fragmentation institutional way with trade, may it be with the real economy. But we may not confuse fragmentation with competition. And to give you a very old example for that, when I was a high school student, all the big airplanes worldwide in Western countries were produced by either McDonnell Douglas or Boeing. And then there was a German Minister of Finance, Franz Josef Strauss, and he asked his economic advisors, what is the biggest change in the economy in my political life? And the answer was the exponential increase of civil aviation. Millions more people will be able to afford a flight ticket, and tens of thousands of airplanes will be needed to satisfy the demand. And then the answer by Franz Josef Strauss was, oh well, if this is the case, then Europe needs an airplane and Bavaria needs an airport. And he has realized both. He has realized both, and the Bavarian airport was constructed and realized exactly within schedule. This is something we still remember, even if we do not understand. Well, this new Berlin airport will come into function as well. You will all see it, at least your children and grandchildren. Things happen sometimes. But what's interesting, when Airbus company was then created, there was a lot of criticism against Franz Josef Strauss. And the most important argument in Germany was that this would mean state subsidies for decades, and we would never ever reach the point where the airplanes become profitable without state subsidies. Now, a couple of years later, Airbus is producing half of the big airplanes worldwide. McDonnell Douglas and Boeing have merged in order to stay competitive. And both companies today, by the way, are facing some accusations of getting privileged treatment by their respective governments. Now the American side is entitled by WTO to impose some sanctions and higher tariffs on the Europeans because of the fact that WTO thinks we have been too nice to Airbus, but there is a similar procedure with regard to Boeing and McDonnell Douglas, and the WTO, as far as we can see, will also find that the American government was too nice with Boeing and McDonnell Douglas. So we will be entitled a couple of months later to similar measures. And I say, well, I could perfectly go along with if he would say, in both cases, we will no longer provide any subsidies on both sides, and then it is just competition and nothing else. But the idea of Franz Josef Strauss was, and that was part of technological sovereignty, he said, if civil aviation becomes such an important part of the value chain of our economies, then Europe must have a vital interest in producing airplanes. Otherwise, we will lose an important part of the value chain, as we lost, by the way, when TV devices were no longer produced in Europe, but in Japan and in South Korea, in Asian countries. This is a normal thing in a world economy, that you lose some skills and some productions, but at the end of the day, if you want to be a successful and a performing country, you have to have something that you can produce at cheaper prices and more efficiently than others around you, and you have to make sure that competition is still possible. And this is why I, for example, have asked the question in my industrial strategy paper, whether Europe and Germany can afford, on the long run, relying entirely on the big internet companies coming from Japan and from China and the US. To give you an example, artificial intelligence is a game changer. There's no doubt about it. It is widely accepted by everybody. When you look and compare public investment in AI in the US and in Europe, it's pretty much the same. It's not such a big difference. But the biggest part of the money is not invested by the American government. It is invested by the big internet companies, several $100 billion a year, by Google, Amazon, Microsoft, Apple, Uber, and eBay, and others. Several $100 billion a year. And this money is not invested in Germany to the same extent, because we do not have the big internet platforms. You have. So it is not my intention stealing away your internet platforms and your companies. No, you have been successful and you can be proud on that. But there will be new platforms in the foreseeable future. And the question is, will one or two of these platforms emerge in Europe, or will all of them emerge in China or in the US? This is something where we have our European industrial interest, and it is perfectly compatible with the rules of market economy. Mrs. Stelzenmüller, I have the last part of your question I did not understand, but the first part I understood very well. You said Alexei Miller has said he will reduce the flow through the Ukrainian pipelines to 10%. That is true. He has made similar announcements. I made always clear that this is not acceptable, that we have to reserve a substantial part of the transit, of the delivery to Europe for transit via Ukraine. I have indicated you numbers and figures that I think would be reasonable. And when I met with Alexei Miller as well, and I met with Novak, the Minister of Energy, several times, and when asked why I believe that Russia and why Russia should make such a big concession, then I said, well, because I believe 70% of something is more than 100% of nothing. That's easy like this. I see a sound environment for all these investments and for the functioning of Nord Stream 2 only then when we take account of the justified interest of Ukraine, and if we avoid unilateral dependency from a single provider. And this is why I have developed my three-pillar model. When looking more specifically into the Ukrainian-Russian debate, then you have several issues pending. One is the exact concrete amount of transit through the existing Ukrainian pipeline. It has, by the way, it has to be unbundled. This is accepted by the Ukrainian government, it's accepted by Russia, it's accepted by the Europeans, and there will be a European consortium then taking charge of the pipeline system. The second point is that there is a pending case, or the case is decided. It's no longer pending. The case is basically decided in the Stockholm arbitrage that Russia will have to pay several billion dollars to the Ukrainian government. Ukraine is entitled to that, but it's not recognized by Russia, and it is very difficult to size the money. So this is something that has to be included in the direct talks between the two countries. And if you take all the elements together, you have a good margin for compromise, for a balanced compromise that in my eyes can be acceptable for both sides.
Mr. Altmaier, that was a tour de force. I'm not sure what was in that coffee, but it was very impressive. And I just want to close by saying keep on provoking debate. I think all of the issues that we've been wrestling with this afternoon are hard. And as you said, not one of us can face these challenges alone. And I hope you do come to Washington as often as your schedule allows. And you are always welcome here at GMF. But please, all of you, join me in thanking the Minister for spending so much time with us.
Thank you so much.